All right. Hello, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed Alumni Weekend, and I want to welcome you to our Tips for Effective Estate Planning session. We'll be featuring speaker Patrick Schmitt, and Richard Ammons will be facilitating the conversation. I am Susan LaCour. I am the Senior Director of Development at the GSB. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for this session. And I want to point out that it is brought to you by the GSB Legacy Partners. This is our visionary group of alumni who have chosen to include the GSB in their estate plans. And if you are interested in learning more about Legacy Partners or would like to discuss gift planning in conjunction with the GSB or Stanford more broadly, please do feel free to reach out to me, contact me directly. This is an hour-long session, and it will be recorded. At any time during the session, please feel free to utilize the chat feature at the bottom of your Zoom window to submit your questions. And Richard will do his best to keep get everyone's questions in front of Patrick. I want to make sure I thank the GSB Legacy Partners Steering Committee, who have been instrumental in helping us pull these sessions together and drive our Legacy Partners program. So first, I'm going to start by introducing you to our speaker and moderator. We have Patrick Schmitt here, who is MBA 2018. Patrick is the co-founder of FreeWill, a social venture which makes estate planning more intuitive and free. I actually saw Patrick along with his classmate and co-founder, Jenny Shaw Spradling, present the idea for FreeWill to the GSB Advisory Council when they were still students. I remember at the time thinking, what a great idea. And since then, FreeWill has helped organizations raise more than $2.8 billion in new planned gifts, stock gifts, and qualified charitable distributions. And in the process, has helped many care for the people and the causes they love. Patrick and his co-founder were recently named 2 of the top 50 philanthropists in the world by Town & Country. Patrick, from 2009 to 2010, ran the email fundraising for President Obama, where his team invented many of the existing practices in digital fundraising. He also served as the head of innovation at change.org, helping grow that organization to 200 million members in just 4 years. Facilitating the conversation is Richard Ammons, a member of the great MBA class of 1977. Richard participated in the public management program while he was at the GSB, and most of his career has been spent in higher education, leading development operations at colleges and universities. Richard is also a member of the Legacy Partners Steering Committee, and we're grateful for the time and guidance that he gives us in building our program. So with that, I will turn it over to Patrick and Richard.
Well, Patrick, it's great to have you here. And why don't I just turn it over immediately to you, and I'll be prepared to field questions at the end of your talk.
Great. Thanks so much for welcoming me, folks. I'm just sharing screen, which I assume you now can all see. Let me know if that's not true. But just welcome. So great to see some familiar faces here. Hi, Derek. Hi, Elizabeth. A bunch of other folks who I don't know, but also probably chipped in to help the class of 2018. And so big thank you for that. And just as we do this, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and anything making you happy this week. So if you have a moment, do that. We'd love to see where folks are around the country or around the world, and we'll go from there. So this session is around some tips around estate planning. Even if you're a millennial, really, if you're anywhere from 18 to 108, this will be a good fit for you. Just a little bit about me. So I'm really, really lucky to be the co-founder and co-CEO of FreeWill. My co-founder is in the bottom left corner here. You can see her, Jenny. She's got a little peace sign going up. We have this sort of wonderful, diverse team all around the country. And so we're super excited. We're almost 100 people. We've raised almost $3 billion at this point in terms of new gifts for charity and for nonprofits. So what does that have to do with estate planning, and how did we somehow become at least somewhat experts in this case? So how did this happen? So this is Jenny and me. This is actually a couple days after we met on campus. We were lucky to be part of the beautiful campus that some of you in earlier classes didn't quite have. And we the sort of big question we asked ourselves is nothing about estate planning. How might we have the sort of biggest possible impact on the world? And what are the different avenues there? And Jenny's background, Jenny was at McKinsey and Bain Capital. Frankly, the smartest person I've ever encountered. My background is very different. I used to run email fundraising for President Obama, had worked at a couple nonprofits before that. And what we realized along the way is that so much work has been gone into making it really easy to donate $20 at a time. And so some of you are going to get emails from the Sierra Club or your undergraduate college or the GSB, and that process is super seamless, right? And things like being able to text to give in the wake of a natural disaster, super easy, great technology, great innovation. But what happened is that bequests, these gifts in a will or trust of charitable gifts, which are $40 billion a year. This is about 10% of all philanthropy in the country. It's twice as much as all corporate giving, just to put this in perspective. This process was still quite hard and confusing. So we did a whole bunch of research as sort of normal, curious GSBers, and we found that part of this is that people really hate estate planning and they're afraid of it. We asked people, we were sort of running around Stanford's campus, trying to get people to talk to us, and a lot of baby boomers and folks in what's called the silent generation above that. And we talked to one guy and he said, "Oh, I don't really know where to start. It feels sort of confusing and sort of overwhelming." We're taking notes, and then we sort of look up and wait, aren't you a rocket scientist? And it turns out that even sort of the smartest and brightest folks really sort of don't really know what they're doing around estate planning. So that's a big part of it. People just don't do estate planning. We'll talk more about that in a second. And then secondly, no one actually asks about charitable giving in the process, which is, this is sort of the moment of biggest allocation of giving. And so we started FreeWill, a company called FreeWill, both a play on making your own choices, and we made free and easy estate planning that actually put charitable giving front and center. And so that the result is that at this point, we're now the leading estate planning tool in the US, and we raise about $5 million a day in terms of new bequests or planned gifts. So that's how I got here, and that's why you're listening to me talk about estate planning. As a quick note, if you have any questions along the way, feel free to just write them in the chat. I think the chat is open for everybody. If not, maybe we can check on that. But feel free to stop along the way. So this is me. This is Jenny. Jenny, by the way, is not part of this call because she is 8.5 months pregnant with her husband, who she also met at the GSB. So we couldn't count on her being here. She is not delivering yet, but that's what Jenny's up to right now. All right, so very important note before we keep going. This is not legal advice. I am not an attorney. We have some attorneys on staff. We do a bunch of other stuff. You might ask them really particular questions, and I will either tell you I don't know the answer, or here's the best place to look in some cases. So very important note for you, and an important disclaimer for Stanford generally. So keep that in mind. All right, so now let's dive in. Let's talk about the state of estate planning in 2021. We'll talk first about what other folks are doing, and then we'll talk about what are the really big questions that you want to be asking to prepare yourself, right? I mean, estate planning is just a fancy way of saying decision-making about some really important stuff. And so we'll talk about what that stuff is, and we'll break it down into pretty accessible things, because the last thing we want is for it to feel overwhelming for folks. So here we are, estate planning in 2021. Well, this actually, for those of you that are sort of interested in finance and macroeconomics, estate planning is turning into one of the most important economic forces over the next few decades. How and where estate planning happens is going to be so incredibly consequential to both the organizations you love, but also families and the broader macroeconomic climate. There is a wide variety of estimates here, but one of the relatively conservative ones is that $68 trillion will pass as baby boomers age over the next few decades. And now that estimate's from Deloitte. It's a couple of years old. And what it means is that it doesn't take into account the stock market growth of the last 12 or 13 months. And so we're really looking at potentially up to $100 trillion down the road, depending on stock market growth, of money transferring generations or transferring somewhere. And so where that money goes is one of the existential questions for the American economy and for American families, et cetera. This is part of what got us interested in. It's the largest wealth transfer in human history, and it potentially is the biggest opportunity for philanthropy ever. So this is how we think about it. You can look at this curve, by the way, of population shifts over time. And you can see that starting in 1946, ending in about 1964, you have this baby boom generation, and they are the largest, certainly the largest until millennials, and the most affluent overall. So Really interesting dynamic to pay attention to. And if you're in finance or if you're in other roles, this will be something to keep an eye on. But the challenge here is that Americans still have an estate planning crisis. And you don't have to sort of voice this in the chat, but you might want to do a mental check-in right now. Do I have any estate planning documents myself? And what you'll see is actually that number is going down a little bit. So this is a Gallup poll, and you can see that over 2017, 2019, 2020, when this poll was done, fewer than 40% of American adults have some estate planning document in place. So it's a pretty tricky thing. Now, you might say, well, that's only young people, but it turns out that actually over 55, you have fewer than half of people have an estate planning document in place. And certainly it's higher than it is for younger folks, but it's still pretty remarkably low. You look at millennials, or sort of some version of millennials, 18 to 34, not perfectly capturing that generation, sub 20%. So this is a pretty big challenge. And we know a lot of different folks are thinking about addressing this, but it's one of the real big issues in the country. You might think, okay, well, it's only folks that don't have a lot of money. And now this doesn't necessarily capture the top end of the market, but even among folks making more than $80,000 a year, or who have that level of income in one format or another, only 45% of folks have an estate plan. So pretty acute. Those of you that do good work in low-income communities will see that this is an even bigger issue. It's also true in a lot of minority communities where you see lower rates of estate planning generally. And so there's a lot of work to do there. Why don't people have this? Well, a couple of different things, but you can see the biggest reason by far is I haven't gotten around to it. And then secondly, people say I don't have enough assets to leave anyone, which is actually not really a good reason. Some people think it's too expensive, and a lot of people just don't know how to do it. But this sort of big hurdle is taking the first step. So we'll walk you through a couple of first steps today, because one thing that people always forget is you can always change this. So people are sort of not ready to make final plans. Don't worry, you can always come back in 6 months and shift it, but that's a big shift. And then this actually jives, you can look at how many people haven't gotten around to it, and then you look, well, maybe people don't think it's important, but it turns out actually it's super important. And a lot of folks, almost 80% in 2019 and 60% in 2020 will say, yes, this is very or somewhat important. And then the number of people that haven't really thought about it has gone up as well. So what else is happening? It's 2021. Obviously, it's been sort of a tumultuous year across the board. We are seeing a big shift into more estate planning and more plan giving overall. So we, meaning FreeWill at this point, has seen more than 100% increase in wills and wills with bequests in almost all months since the pandemic began compared to 2019. It is also the case, and many of you do this for research, but Google Trends can be a really good indicator of what popular interest looks like. And searches for things like how to make a will, or make a will online, or what is a trust, all these things are at the highest they have been in the history of Google. And in some months, 50% higher than they were ever before the pandemic. So clearly this is front of mind for a lot of folks across the board. And this is what it looks like, sort of internal metrics. And you can see you have massive shifts in terms of sort of new search, new usage around estate planning across the board. So in case you're curious, by the way, this giant spike in April of 2019 is when the AARP magazine, I'm sure a couple of you get it at least, which goes out to 37 million baby boomers, that went out. And so you can see that actually organic interest is even higher, April 2020 is even higher than it was when basically the word went out over direct mail to 37 million boomers. So pretty significant there. And then bequests similarly. What's actually interesting is the pandemic not only increased estate planning, but actually more people chose to give during the pandemic when they were making estate plans. And we don't actually know exactly why that is, but it may be because sort of more sense of interconnectivity in the last 15 months than perhaps if it was easier to be in your own world in 2019. So what are the big things to think about? That's what's happening in the world. That's what, you sort of look at what are adults broadly doing. For those of you to think, okay, great, this all sounds good, seems important. What do I actually do? I wanted to lay out, I think, 7 or 8 different topic areas and just start with some thought-provoking questions. And these are really the things to figure out. Like the actual mechanics of making an estate plan, not that hard. What happens is that people sort of steer away from the mechanics because they don't really want to make the decisions yet. And so thinking about the decisions in some pretty clear sort of 8th grade level language, hopefully will make this a lot easier. So big things. First thing, number one, the most important thing, if you have minor children, who's going to look after the kids? So in a two-parent setup, it is usually the case that the surviving parent will get custody. But if both parents pass away for some reason, or one parent is unable to take care of the kids, a guardian is effectively responsible for children's daily needs: food, housing, healthcare, education, clothing, et cetera, et cetera. So you think about choosing wisely. This is the moment. And if no guardian is named, a court decides, which is not a place you want to be. So this is particularly important. We'll talk more about how to do this. Things to consider is people just say, I don't know, I trust Susan, or I trust Richard, he seems fine. And then you sort of get through this whole process. But a couple things to think about. One, do you have a religious preference for how the kids are raised? Because it's not true that all your friends are going to raise them that way. And so think about that. Who has the physical ability, right? If your 55, 60, 65-year-old parents are young and spry now, what is it going to look like in 8 or 10 years, right? Or your uncle or your aunt or whomever. Who has the emotional stability? Those of you that have kids know it's not always the easiest thing. So what sort of demeanor might someone have? Who has the financial stability, right? Where it's unlikely to sort of be a seesaw in terms of economic ability to provide for a child. And also geography, right? If your parents are in a certain place, but potentially aren't able to look after the kids, and you still want them nearby, well, then maybe you have a 50-mile circle, and you have to think about who lives within that section that might be a good fit. So a couple things to think about. Also, this is really important. Don't make this a surprise. On occasion, we hear people who assign guardians and yet haven't told them, and then something happens, and suddenly, Ashish learns from the court that he now has a child to take care of. And that is something you almost certainly want to have a conversation about in advance. And yet you would be surprised how often that is not the case. So even if you love your cousins or your sister or your brother or your best friend from the GSB, and they might make great parents, just make sure to have that conversation in advance. You don't want to get stuck there. Okay, so first thing, guardians, and potentially the most important, right? If everything else goes to waste, getting the guardians right, super important. Second thing, same thing, who will manage the estate? So within a will or a trust, you'll typically have an executor, and that person is broadly responsible for carrying out your wishes. So these important considerations are things like, do they have the time to do it? It may be that your hyper competent friend who is running his or her own company or running her law firm or whoever may be really well situated to do it, but may not have time to do it. And so this is an important consideration. Being an executor is not super hard, but it does mean dealing with a lot of financial advisors and financial accounts, with lawyers, with courts, et cetera. So is this the type of person who's going to be intimidated by that? Or will they think, okay, this is just a process made by humans and I can handle it? So that's a big piece. Third, this is important. Besides sort of being competent, are they going to have the EQ to deal with loved ones, or the emotional quotient? So many of these folks will be the ones discussing with family who's getting what, et cetera. And so you may be putting someone into a hornet's nest, especially if you haven't had all this conversation in advance. And so making sure that that's someone who has the equanimity to handle that. That will be important. And then also, don't make this a surprise. The last thing you want to do is have someone sort of, find out at the wrong time that they now have all this responsibility. And if you can tell them in advance, it will also give them a chance to ask a couple of questions for things that they might not understand. All right, 3, and one that's sort of most commonly thought of. And so 3 is often thought of as the only thing in a will or a trust, but it's just one of many. But who gets the stuff? So things like everything from a fancy car to real estate to stamp collections to photo albums, which have no objective value but might have a deep amount of intrinsic value. Choosing who gets what is especially important. Do you want to divide things evenly or according to need? So if you have 3 children and one of them has been extremely economically successful and financially successful, are they going to get a third, or are they going to get 10% because the other 2 might need more help? Right? And so these are important questions that you'd want to think about. And we see a lot of both. So there's no right answer here, but it's certainly the case. Do you want to solicit preferences in advance? Those of you that have taken negotiations might know that the stamp collection and the photo album might have more value to one person than the other, and figuring out how you can solicit different preferences as well might make this a bit smoother and avoid horse trading later. Should real estate or other really large assets, should it be sold and divided? Should one child have the right to buy others out? Should they have to keep it in the family and use it as a reunion spot? So all of these are important questions. Typically, by the way, most people are choosing to sell and divide. So if you're looking at what the norm might be, the idea of having sort of an ancestral home in the family for generations is appealing. It often ends up being a lot more work, and folks tend to sell it down the road in some cases also. Other big things to think about here. Is there anyone who you specifically don't want to receive something? So I'm sure that with 106 people on the call, some of you are divorced, some of you have difficult family situations. We won't make you explain it in the chat, but this is an important thing to think about. And the courts will be much easier to navigate if you say explicitly, I don't want anything to go here, or I don't want anything to go to this person. So something to know and an important consideration as well. And then this is also really, really important. So a lot of people will say, I made a will, I made a trust, everything's good. What's happened with the way that financial instruments have shifted over time and savings instruments have shifted over time is that a lot of what we think of as financial stuff is held in what are called non-probate accounts with things that are called POD or TOD, payable on death or transfer on death. And this is really, really important. So things like your entire IRA account, which you might put in money for 50 years, that will be a lot of money. That is not going to necessarily go through a probate process in most states. So this is really key. Some trusts, retirement accounts, life insurance policies don't go according to the will. Some investment accounts. If you have I got a notification this morning that my E-Trade account, which doesn't have that much money in it, doesn't have a beneficiary. And I run an estate planning company, so I'm sure that some of you are also making this mistake and need to get on it. So you want to really inventory the things that you have and realize what is going to go into, what will sort of funnel into a will or a trust, and what is just on its own. Now, there are some real benefits to having POD and TOD clauses because you won't have to wait for courts and other things like that to transfer. But you don't want to sort of forget one big account. That will throw this whole thing off. This is the most common big mistake that people make. So I'm just going to pause for a second so it sinks in. When people screw up estate planning, this is potentially the top mistake that people make. It's just the most common thing. And it's a natural thing to be confused about, but it's really key. Before we go on, actually, one other thing that's really important here, I don't have slides on it, but I just wanted to mention it quickly, is obviously a lot of folks have money in 401k or IRA accounts, really important for beneficiaries. These are also actually increasingly one of the dominant charitable vehicles. Now, why is that? Well, you guys probably know this, but just a quick primer. IRAs, not Roth IRAs, but traditional IRAs typically get pre-tax money. So the government says, put it in, pay income tax on it later, grow, no capital gains taxes. And then when you take it out, you're paying income tax. And so at 72, now the government says, okay, you have to start taking money out. If you pass an IRA onto someone else, they have to pay income taxes on it. And usually, and not in all cases, in most cases, they have to take all of that out within 10 years. So you may be pushing people into a very high tax bracket, especially if you live in a place like New York or California, where half of that will go in. And this is true whether or not you're above the estate tax threshold. And so a lot of folks are thinking thoughtfully about, well, if I'm going to leave some money to charity, the IRA is a really good one. Because all of this sort of general cash will go, if I'm not above the estate tax threshold, it will go right to my heirs. The IRA is going to get taxed quite heavily. And so thinking about that as a charitable venue as well. So just a small note, that's a trend that we've seen dramatic shifts in over the last 7 or 8 years as an industry. And so just keeping an eye on that. Because especially if you're thinking about, well, I'm going to leave the IRA to my son, Mark, and I'm going to leave the bank account to my daughter, Rachel. Well, you might think that's fair. And then suddenly Mark ends up with a lot less money because he's got to pay taxes on that, where Rachel doesn't have to pay taxes on hers. So good question. Elizabeth asks, does geography matter with respect to who's chosen as an executor? It is not impossible to do so from afar. And so there's a lot of stuff, it'll be phone calls and other things like that. I would not suggest someone who's not in the US. Certainly time zones, if you have no other options potentially, but for the most part, you'll want somebody who's super fluent in English to navigate the court system. You'll want someone who is sort of easily accessible from a time zone perspective, et cetera. And so if that is your only option, I'm sure this person will be competent enough to figure it out, but usually preferable to have somebody close by. Francis says that France, this is true, by the way. So France and some other countries have different laws around sort of mandatory inheritance patterns and things like that. So pretty tricky. Great questions. Okay, 4, this is a really interesting thing. What happens to pets? So please don't leave anything to your dog. Your dog is not, in the eyes, is potentially wonderful, probably wonderful. In the eyes of the law, not someone who can own possessions. And yet this will happen sometimes. So not on our platform because we really sort of skew people against it, but you hear different stories about that. So we also love your pet. Do not leave anything to your pet. You can leave your dog to someone and make sure that she is looked after. And you can leave a specific amount to the pet guardian for the caretaking of your pet. So this is sort of how that works. You can also have a trust or the executor pay out a specific amount per month or year for the lifetime of the pet. So this is important. There was a case in New York a couple years back where someone was assigned about $1,000 a month to look after this cat for the lifetime of the cat. And then the cat was sort of living an absurdly long time. And it turned out that the woman had sort of swapped in 3 new cats over time because the monthly payment was that. So there's some risk of fraud here, but just so you know, typically leave your pet to someone. Again, don't make it a surprise. If Susan's allergic to cats and you sort of don't know that and you just drop a cat on her, she's got some hard choices to make. So make sure to have a conversation in advance. All right, digital assets, another one that is sort of newly important in the last 10 years. Many people now choose to name a digital executor. These are folks who are responsible for managing or closing social media accounts, email, et cetera. They also include all the videos and phones you may have on your computer. Excuse me, videos or photos. These things are, they're taking the place of the massive family photo albums. So, when we were selling my grandparents' estate, we have 7 children. Those 7 children all had lots of Catholic events. And so all of, the books and books and books of these things are enormous. Now, all of that's going to be in a relatively small device or in an iCloud somewhere. And so having someone assigned to take care of that is really important. This is usually a non-legal document. So it accompanies a will with some very specific instructions and things like passwords. So here you want someone who's going to be judicious and will sort of close it and feel like probably tech savvy. So you may not want to leave someone who's a little bit uncomfortable with all this stuff. And this is going to be very clear. This is also one of the bigger challenges. So this is, by the way, particularly true for cryptocurrency. Those of you that have crypto, make sure that someone can access that. Now, if you have something like Coinbase, it's a little bit easier. But there have been cases where literally $100 million was lost because somebody passed away and don't have the password to the crypto account. And so I'm sure some folks are invested in crypto. Just be extra sure, because E-Trade will call you and sort of track down your family to figure out where that's going. That is not going to be true of crypto. And so there may be a really big risk there. And if those of you that bought crypto 3 years ago, that's now a serious amount of money. So make sure to look after that as well. 6, do you discuss all of this in advance? So some families choose to do this, some don't. But having a clear, articulate estate plan is step 1 to preventing intra-family fighting in the aftermath of an unexpected loss. And even if your family is sort of very thoughtful, very kind to each other, et cetera, the shock of losing a loved one creates more challenges than you might see otherwise. So you don't want to presuppose that all will go smoothly, even if your siblings or your kids or whomever gets along really well. So increasingly, many people are choosing to talk about these decisions as a family in advance to avoid unnecessary conflict. But the big risk actually isn't conflict. Conflict happens, but it's confusion. So making sure key parties know where the plan is and the values and logic behind the decisions will make it much easier to carry it out. So this is a shift. This never makes for good movies. So you don't sort of see, there's no Knives Out where people are just trying to figure it out and collaborate amongst themselves. But it's a really important thing. So understanding the logic that you have behind this and exactly where all this stuff is will be really important. But some of you, your experience with estate planning, the next thing will be around your parents and thinking about it. And the majority of millennials have never spoken to their parents about estate planning. I assume the same is true of Gen X and baby boomers. And many don't know how to broach the topic. So having this conversation is really, really important. And what we've seen in a bunch of the research is that you can frame it in looking for advice or in sharing, rather than saying, just tell me about the estate plans. So an example, for instance, say, I'm making a will for the first time. How did you and mom pick an executor? How did that happen? And that opens up the conversation in a way that is not sort of as challenging for folks. Or in case anything happens, I want you to know where my plans are. How did you guys decide what a safe place to use was? And so this sort of frame of asking for advice instead of sitting them down and just saying, tell me about the estate plans, ends up in a much friendlier conversation, much easier. And frankly, it's more likely that you'll do it because it's a more accessible conversation. It doesn't feel so intimidating. So just a quick aside there. And then 7, this is really important. What happens at your funeral? So other people are going to try to guess what you wanted, and that's going to be hard for them, especially in a difficult time, and it's more stress. So is having a religious ceremony important to you? If so, what ceremony? Not everyone's going to know that. Are there specific songs or readings that are meaningful? Are there people you would want to speak? Are there people you don't want to speak? I mean, that seems like a really useful thing to highlight. I'm sure you can imagine someone in your life where you think, oh, please don't. And yet, no one's going to know that unless you lay it out. Do you have burial wishes? Increasingly, some folks are, turning themselves into a tree. Some people want a mausoleum. All these things are sort of on the table. Do you want people to send donations somewhere in lieu of flowers? To where? Where might that be? What feeling do you want people to have at the event? And this is actually probably the first question before you get into the sort of who, what, where, when. Right? What are you passing on in that context? And then just 8. One of the things we're seeing, one of the sort of most exciting parts of our job, is that many people choose to include gifts to their favorite causes and nonprofits. Some people will choose just 1. Some are going to leave up to 12 in their plans. And so there's a whole variety. I think I personally have 6 or 7, which is a mix of sort of causes I'm really passionate about. I included Georgetown, which is my alma mater. I included the GSB, which was a great place for me to be. And so also they send you really nice stuff when this happens. Most people don't know this, but they sort of treated very well. And all the other giving societies are sort of not currently accessible to me, or many of them, because of the level I can give at. So definitely something to think about. A typical method here, by the way, is to choose a percentage of a total estate rather than a cash amount. Why is this useful? Well, if your estate goes way down and you actually had sort of meant to give 10% to charity and 90% of the kids, but then the 10% eats the whole thing, that's not really a good setup. Also, the case is that as your investments grow, you don't have to sort of continually reallocate and check in on this. So percentage amount tends to be much friendlier for the donor and actually much easier for the charity. One other note is that historically, we did some research on this, only about 15 to 25% of these gifts are known about in advance. So it's super useful to the charity to say, hey, I put you in my will, just so you know. So you can sort of think about that. They'll usually send you lots of thank you notes and other things like that. But it makes the lives of people at these organizations that you care about much, much easier. It's sort of a huge shift. And you can always change it, right? You're not sort of locked in because you change a charity. So just something to think about too. This is something to add. And the charity also allows it to, it's helpful to have percentages generally, rather than trying to continually allocate specific amounts as your plans change. Great. So what should we do now? We're going to wrap up. A couple of thoughts to do this. One is do it. Get started. Remember, you can always change your plans. So none of this is final, but having something in place is a really great process for you to sort of identify your own values, et cetera. You want to decide what the vehicles are. We haven't talked much about this, but you want to focus on a will or a trust. A place like California, most people move to a trust because the probate process gets to be so complicated. In other states, a will is sufficient. And then as your assets get larger and larger, many people choose to do trust, et cetera. Inventory your non-probate assets. So this is a really, really important thing. If you take away nothing from the whole session, think my non-probate assets I need to check in on, because there's not going to naturally flow through some area. And then think about this less as a financial chore and more as one of the biggest expressions of your values that you'll ever have. I mean, this is some of the biggest decisions you'll ever make. And so it's a really important one and can be actually quite joyful source of reflection. And then if you have any questions for me, feel free to reach out at patrick@freewill.com. And then Susan, Susan, you can wave, this is her email here. So she's the GSB, and if you have any questions about, thinking about including a gift in your will or trust of the GSB, or what are the options, or what other people in your class have done, she'll be a really great resource, and is generally a wonderful person. So reach out to Susan as well. All right, Richard, we have some questions. I'll turn it over to you to moderate.
Okay, thank you. Patrick, that was great. A lot of really, really great information here. You mentioned in this last slide, decide on whether or not you want to focus on a will or a trust. What kinds of questions should you be asking yourselves to make that decision, will versus trust?
It's a great question. I think as people tend to have more assets, they move more into a trust. The case against the trust is it's more complicated to set up. It can be a little bit more expensive. You almost always need a lawyer for it. A will, even if you're using an attorney, it tends to be a lot cheaper, a lot simpler. So what happens is that a lot of folks who are younger, especially when they have children, and they really need that guardianship decision made and that executor decision made, they'll do a will. And then as they accumulate more assets, as the kids leave the house, as they sort of figure out, okay, I'm going to start moving the house and the boat into the trust, then they'll have a trust and they'll spend a bunch more money on it. So it can be expensive, but it varies state by state. I'm sure your San Francisco lawyers are more expensive than other parts of the country as well.
Right. And rules change from state to state regarding trusts and wills?
Exactly. So actually, hold on 10 seconds. I'm in West Virginia at the moment. We just had a thunderstorm roll in. So closing that window saved us some short circuiting. Yeah, so rules, one of the sort of unhelpful things about running a trust in a state startup, or generally about this country, is that we're based on 50 states of law. And so it varies quite a bit. And as a quick aside, Louisiana, super unhelpfully, is based on Napoleonic Code, whereas 49 states are based on English common law. So Louisiana is this whole separate pain.
Right. Someone mentioned that some money managers don't allow for either. They weren't sure if it was, they don't allow for the percentages. You talked about leaving assets to charity by percentage or versus amounts. Do you have any clarification about that?
Yeah, sometimes that happens. For the most part, they tend to prefer percentages because, as you can imagine, a retirement account is going up and down every second in terms of the assets in it. So it's very difficult to spell out specific cash amounts because the market goes up, the market goes down, or the bond market shifts, and so that will change pretty dramatically. So that is the case. My guess is that you'll want to look at that on a case-by-case basis. It's not overwhelmingly true. So that may be true for some custodians, in which case you'll have to make some special adjustments there.
Great, great. I think there are a couple of new messages in. Anything special to think about with respect to international assets?
Yeah,
real
great
estate
question.
in another country.
So for the most part, this is going to be distributed based on the laws of that country. So if you are a French person and you have an estate in Berkeley or in the Bay Area, you are going to need an American will, and then all of your French assets held in France, you're going to have an estate plan there. And certainly there are people that are more familiar with French estate law than I am. And so you'll have to, that will vary country by country. And so you want to make sure you have something in place there for those of you that do have overseas assets or just assets in multiple countries as well.
Gotcha.
So good question.
A question from Allison Graham. One of the most important reasons for having estate documents, especially a trust, is to help prevent or thwart financial elder abuse, which is an epidemic in our country. Can you speak to that?
Sure, this is right. I mean, I think there's some good laws in place around this, but the risk is that if they don't have something in place, what happens is the guardian, the sort of caretaker, other things, other folks that maybe have access to a vulnerable elderly person are just going to sort of push that. The way that this is counteracted historically is most estate planning documents need 2 witnesses. And so that's a big shift. It is more the case, I believe, I'll have to check this, that I don't believe things like switching custodians of non-probate assets require witnesses in most cases. And so that's something to pay extra attention on. So if you have an elderly parent who you think is at risk, double check on those non-probatable assets first, because I can log on to E-Trade today and change my beneficiary. So that's the risk. Now, the wills are one of the last documents that you can't e-sign. You need to be there. You need to be, you need to have witnesses. Those witnesses can't, in almost all states, they can't be in the will. So, so it's not as though I can sort of, walk a document down to my parents and say, sign this, my brother and I have decided we're going to get everything and we're going to, we'll witness it. So there's a bunch of dynamics there, and there are some things in place there, but it's something to watch out for particularly.
Gotcha. From Kate Curry, trust specific questions, pros and cons of an institutional trustee or co-trustee, pros and cons of a lifetime trust versus one that gets fully distributed.
Kate, I think I might punt on this question. This is a good one for your attorney. Generally, institutional trustees cost more. They'll certainly be around to a greater degree and are better at this more efficiently than an individual who may still have some executor fee, but may not. And so typically, a trust who's getting managed may also take management fees, et cetera. And so maybe it's worth it for peace of mind, but overall the sort of expenses will be higher. The lifetime trust and ones that get fully distributed, that's going to depend a lot on the individual circumstance. Sometimes these trusts exist for sort of to segment out distributions over time to someone that you don't trust to actually take a full amount up front. If someone's 18, you might say, okay, $20,000 a year or whatever, but we're not going to drop a huge check on an 18-year-old because, for obvious reasons. So there are some things to think about, but it really depends on the individual circumstances you have.
Gotcha. There's one question that's sort of a little different was they want to know about your business model. What's FreeWill's business model?
Yeah, we love FreeWill. So FreeWill's model is totally free estate planning. And then what happens is we work with about 600 charities. So the Red Cross, the United Way, Wikipedia, a whole bunch of local animal shelters, a bunch of religious groups, et cetera. And so we provide custom versions of the tools that then those nonprofits share with their own supporters. And so that's gone really well because then the supporters get access to all these free tools. And within that process, it makes it very easy to give to, Greenpeace or whomever the charity is. And people can always sort of not include a gift or, add their church or alma mater or whatever. So that's been great. So it's we do that. And then we do a bunch of other complex giving types like giving stock, which I could spend another hour talking about, or giving what are called QCDs. So those of you over 70 might have heard about these. These are gifts directly out of your IRA, and they are the fastest growing type of giving in America. So we think a lot about, there's a bunch of giving types that are win-win, better for the donors, better for the organizations. How do we make those easy? And then we work with specific nonprofits. So if you know any nonprofits that want to work with us, just shoot me an email. But thank you for that question.
Great. And someone has also talked about, we're impressed by your notion of that this is a expression of values instead of a chore. Any more thoughts about that?
Yeah. First of all, this is by far the biggest gift you're going to make, whether it's to a charity or to your kids or anything else. Think about everything, all the holiday presents, all the birthday presents, all the love and support. Well, not the love and support, but all the sort of monetary support or things like that you might give. Usually inheritance tend to dwarf that. So that's a big deal, right? This is going to sort of change the life of a lot of folks. And then same thing as we think about the causes you really care about. An IRS study from a bunch of years ago, so it probably needs to get updated, shows that a typical bequest is 3 times the total amount of all of your giving ever in your lifetime. So over your lifetime, you might give away $80,000, which is a lot of money. And then a typical bequest from that person might be $240,000. So it just dwarfs, when you think about, if you're thoughtful about charitable giving, this is the time to be extra thoughtful because it's a thing that really, really, really matters. And the same is true if you're thoughtful about how you want to support your son or your daughter or your cousin or your friends. This is the point that really, really matters. And these are hard decisions, right? They're sort of what best encapsulates my values. So they're really good ones too.
Minjong wants to know, how are the skill set job descriptions for trustee executor different?
This is a good question. So executors tend to be sort of a one-time deal, right? So and that one time may take 12 months. So it's not in and out. But a trustee, especially for someone managing something over the long haul, if they're distributions or other things like that, they need to be consistent and persistent, potentially over decades. And so that may be a different personality type or competence level. Trustees tend to be a little bit more purely financial. Executors, there's going to be a lot of stuff. Someone might be running an estate sale, things like that, right? Someone's going to have to be sort of using that EQ of explaining to the family what's happening. And so, but the biggest thing I think is the time blocking on executors as well.
How do you make estate plans relatively safe from future changes in estate planning laws?
That is a very good question. So honestly, it depends. I mean, the thing to keep in mind is you will always be around to change them if the law changes. So you can shift your. It is never going to be the case that you pass away, and then 9 months later estate law changes, and then that affects the inheritance. So you will always have time to do that. The best thing you can do is actually stay on top of it. And really what is going to change is the rates on, well, it's probably two things actually. So the rates on overall estate planning, or the thresholds rather. So is it right now, I think it's about 21 million for a couple. It used to be about half that. And so that may shift. The other thing is a little wonky is what's called a step-up basis. And some of you will probably know what this is. Step-up basis means that if I pass things on to Richard, especially appreciated assets, the cost basis for calculating capital gains goes down to zero. So it means that if you inherit a bunch of stocks or appreciated assets, the cost basis resets when you inherit them. That could change. There's sort of a reasonable policy proposal in place that says, okay, well, that doesn't really make sense if we're protecting, sort of wiping out capital gains taxes for that particular area. So that was probably going to be a shift. But as I mentioned earlier, if you sort of stay on top of this, you always can go back and change it. What it likely means is that sort of split around who gets which assets, whether it's charity or whether it's your kids, are going to have to just tweak a little bit based on the taxation of any of those assets.
And a related question from Richard Stuckey was, how much should minimizing estate taxes play in developing estate plans?
Sure. So, I mean, if you're above the estate tax threshold, it's something to at least think about. And we'll sort of take for granted that you don't want to pay more taxes in this context. So, people do things, and this is going to be a more complex topic that we can dive into at a different point. But things like moving a lot of money to life insurance, which falls outside the estate tax, and so some people do things like that. That's sort of a very common thing. A little bit complicated, but basically you buy super expensive life insurance policy, and then that goes to the trust or the heirs or whomever, and that falls outside of the estate tax. So, but also things like sort of preemptive giving or establishing a trust early on. You can even do things like, put qualified sale of small business stock in a trust separately, which will save you things earlier.
How often should one revisit an estate plan, assuming no major life changes? Every year, every 5 years?
I think every 5 years is probably a good thing. And then, when we think about life changes, it's a great question, Francis. Bought a new house. I married someone new. I had a new kid. I had a new grandkid. I retired sometimes. Made a major acquisition of something, from a thing standpoint. Or I sold and made, a big thing. So, previously someone got the boat and someone got the car, and now the boat's gone. We might need to think about revisiting that. So, but 5 years generally. I mean, setting some version of a calendar reminder every 5 years, if you don't visit it more frequently, is probably a good rule.
And this might be a lob, but is it better to work with FreeWill than hiring an estate attorney?
Great question. I mean, the answer is probably no. I mean, it depends what your needs are, right? So it's a great start, and a lot of people will do it, and it'll be sort of perfectly sufficient. if you have a highly complex plan, one thing that a lot of people do is they actually go to FreeWill, use it, and then use it for all the decision making, like a lot of the stuff that we just talked about. So you can sit in the comfort of your own home with your spouse or your friends and sort of chat about this, and then say, great, these are my decisions, and then bring it to an attorney. So if you've got a very large estate, or you have a bunch of stepchildren in a complicated family situation, or you have property in France, things like that, you definitely want to pair it with an attorney, but actually using that to get ready is really good. So a lot of people do both, or a lot of people do, will use it to make their estate plans. And then a lot of people will say, great, I'm going to use this to get everything in order. And then we have a whole set of what we call documented wishes, which will get you, again, this is all totally free, but it'll get you sort of really prepped in the comfort of your own home. If you don't know an estate planning attorney, it's really scary to walk into an office and say, and they'll just be like, okay, we're going to make big decisions today, and we're going to charge by the hour. And so, being able to do some of that on your own before you get there can be really useful.
Gotcha. And will FreeWill review of an estate plan and comment on it?
Nope. There are very clear rules and regulations in various states about what is practicing law and what isn't. And we are very good at staying on the right side of that. So things like reviewing estate plans and commenting on it and saying, I wouldn't do that, I would think about doing that. There's a bunch of sort of general process tips along the way, but then once you make the plan, we leave it to you.
Great. Well, this is great. Patrick, thank you so much. I've learned a lot. I think others, sounds like others have as well. And Susan, I guess I'll pass it back over to you.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Patrick and Richard, particularly. It was really great to hear from you, and fascinating business that you're running, and just so glad that it's doing well and that you're serving so many people. It's just an excellent model. Thank you so much for sharing. It sounds like we've wrapped up questions. So if there's nothing else, we'll sign off and thank everyone for participating in Alumni Weekend.